Sometimes mercy arrives in the desert disguise of desperation, teaching two strangers that love grows strongest in the harshest soil of necessity and sacrifice. Jacob Sterling rode his weathered mare across the sun-baked Texas plains, his graying temples damp with perspiration beneath his worn Stetson. The cattle had wandered farther than usual this September morning, and the solitary rancher was making his way back to his homestead when he spotted a thin column of smoke rising near the Colorado River bend. His horse snorted nervously as they approached the marshy ground where recent floods had left treacherous patches of quicksand and mud. The smoke came from a small signal fire, barely smoldering in the humid air. Jacob dismounted carefully, his boots squelching in the soft earth as he moved closer to investigate. Then he saw them. A Navajo woman, her long black hair matted with clay, was trapped waist-deep in the boggy marsh. In her arms, held high above the dangerous mire, was an infant wrapped in a colorful woven blanket. The woman, its dark eyes met his with fierce determination rather than fear, though her situation was clearly desperate. Jacob quickly uncoiled his lasso from his saddle horn, testing the rope, his strength with calloused hands. The woman watched his every movement with sharp intelligence, understanding his intent without words. He found a sturdy piece of driftwood, wedging it against a nearby boulder to create leverage. The rescue proved more difficult than anticipated. The clay-like mud held her with stubborn persistence, making sucking sounds as Jacob worked the rope around her shoulders. She never cried out, never showed panic, even as the thick marsh seemed determined to claim her. Her only concern was keeping the baby safe and dry above the treacherous surface. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Jacob managed to pull both mother and child free from their muddy prison. The woman collapsed onto solid ground, still clutching her infant protectively. Jacob offered her his water canteen and gestured toward his horse, speaking in the simple Spanish he knew from trading with Mexican vaqueros. She nodded silently, accepting his unspoken invitation to safety. As they rode toward his ranch, Jacob wondered what circumstances had brought her to this remote and dangerous place, but he respected her silence. The desert had its own harsh justice, and sometimes survival depended on the kindness of strangers. The wooden ranch house stood solitary against the vast Texas landscape, its weathered planks bearing witness to countless seasons of wind and rain. Jacob guided his horse toward the modest structure, glancing back at the woman who rode behind him in silence. Her infant had fallen asleep against her chest, seemingly untroubled by their earlier ordeal. Inside the simple dwelling, Jacob gestured toward the kitchen table and moved to stoke the dying embers in the stone fireplace. The woman remained near the doorway, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the sparsely furnished room. A sense of wariness emanated from her posture, though she showed no signs of wanting to flee. Jacob filled a tin pot with water from the well bucket and set it over the flames to heat. He retrieved a loaf of bread from the pantry and placed it on the table alongside a jar of preserves his late mother had made the previous autumn. The woman watched these simple gestures with careful attention, as if memorizing each kindness. When the coffee began to brew, filling the room with its rich aroma, Jacob brought out his mother's old rocking chair from the bedroom corner. The woman's eyes softened slightly at this offering, and she settled into the chair with her baby, beginning a gentle rocking motion that seemed to soothe them both. That first evening, Jacob made his bed on the front porch, his rifle within easy reach. He understood that trust would take time to build, and he respected her need for space and safety. Through the window, he could see her silhouette in the firelight, humming soft melodies to her child in a language that sounded like whispered prayers. The next morning, Jacob woke to find fresh coffee already brewing and dust swept from the wooden floors. The woman had begun small tasks of gratitude, moving through his home with natural grace while maintaining her careful distance. She prepared simple meals using ingredients she found in his pantry, adding unfamiliar spices that transformed ordinary beans and cornbread into something more flavorful. Their communication remained wordless but grew more understanding with each passing hour. Jacob would nod his appreciation for her efforts, and she would respond with barely perceptible acknowledgments. When the baby cried, both adults would instinctively move to comfort the child, creating an unspoken partnership and care. On the third morning, as golden sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Jacob cleared his throat and placed his weathered hand against his chest. "Jacob," he said slowly, meeting her eyes with gentle patience. The woman paused in her task of grinding corn, considering his gesture with thoughtful silence. After a long moment, She touched her own chest with delicate fingers. "Ayanna," she spoke softly, the syllables flowing like water over stones. Jacob repeated the name carefully, his rough voice struggling with the unfamiliar sounds until she nodded with what might have been approval. The baby gurgled from his makeshift cradle near the hearth, and Ayanna smiled for the first time since her rescue. "Dakota," she whispered, indicating the child. Jacob approached slowly, extending one calloused finger toward the infant, who grasped it with surprising strength. An unexpected warmth spread through the rancher's chest at this simple connection. As days passed, their wordless partnership deepened into something resembling domestic harmony. Ayanna moved through the house with quiet efficiency, her skilled hands transforming simple materials into useful items. She wove grass into sturdy baskets, mended Jacob's torn shirts with intricate stitching, and prepared meals that filled the lonely house with unfamiliar but comforting aromas. Jacob spent his afternoons repairing leather tack near the fireplace while Ayanna worked on her crafts. The rhythmic sounds of their separate labors created a peaceful symphony that neither had experienced in years. When Dakota fussed, Jacob found himself naturally responding to the child's needs, heating milk or walking the floor with gentle steps. Evenings brought a special magic to their temporary family. After supper, Ayanna would hold Dakota close and sing ancient songs in her native tongue. The melodies were haunting and beautiful, filling the small house with echoes of distant mountains and endless skies. Jacob would sit quietly, whittling small toys for the baby while listening to these musical prayers. Small gestures of care began flowing between them like a gentle current. Jacob would leave wildflowers on the kitchen table, and Ayanna would prepare his favorite coffee with extra attention. When he returned from checking cattle, she would have warm water ready for washing, and he would bring her interesting stones or feathers found during his rides across the plains. The thunder of approaching hooves shattered the peaceful morning as 3 riders crested the hill overlooking Jacob's ranch. Dust clouds billowed behind their horses as they rode with purposeful determination toward the modest homestead. Jacob stepped onto his porch, rifle resting casually in the crook of his arm, while Ayanna retreated into the house with Dakota pressed against her chest. The lead rider wore the black coat and white collar of a preacher, his stern face weathered by years of delivering harsh sermons to frontier congregations. Beside him rode a portly merchant from Willow Creek, his expensive vest straining across his belly, and bringing up the rear came Deputy Sheriff Mills, his badge catching the morning sunlight. "Sterling," called the preacher as they reined in their mounts near the porch. "We need to have words with you about this situation you have created for yourself in this community." Jacob remained silent, his gray eyes moving between the 3 men with careful assessment. The deputy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly reluctant to be part of this delegation, while the merchant mopped perspiration from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "The good people of Willow Creek are talking, Jacob," continued the preacher, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "A Christian man cannot live in sin with an unmarried woman, regardless of the circumstances that brought her here. It sets a poor example for our families and children." The merchant leaned forward in his saddle. "There is a simple solution to this problem, Sterling. You will marry this woman immediately, making your arrangement legal and proper in the eyes of God and man. Otherwise, we will be forced to remove her to the reservation where she belongs." Deputy Mills cleared his throat nervously. "Jacob, I've got nothing personal against you, but the law is the law. If you do not make this right, there could be serious trouble. Some folks in town are already talking about taking matters into their own hands." Jacob felt his jaw tighten at the implied threat, but he kept his voice level. "And if I refuse this generous offer of yours, then we return tomorrow with papers to take the woman and child away," replied the preacher coldly. "The choice is entirely yours, but choose you must." The 3 men waited in heavy silence while Jacob considered their ultimatum. Through the window, he could see Ayanna watching with worried eyes, understanding enough of the situation to recognize the danger it represented for her and Dakota. "I will give you my answer when you return tomorrow," Jacob said finally. The riders wheeled their horses around and departed as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving Jacob alone with the weight of an impossible decision. The weight of the impending marriage hung over the ranch like an approaching dust storm, heavy with unspoken consequences. Jacob spent the afternoon pacing the length of his porch, his boots wearing a groove in the weathered planks as he wrestled with the impossible choice thrust upon him by the town delegation. As evening shadows lengthened across the prairie, Jacob saddled his horse for the ride to Willow Creek. He needed supplies and information, though he dreaded facing the whispered conversations and hostile stares that awaited him in town. Ayanna watched from the doorway as he prepared to leave, her dark eyes reflecting understanding of the gravity of their situation. The general store fell silent when Jacob entered, conversations dying mid-sentence as townspeople turned to stare at the man who had become the subject of their moral outrage. He purchased coffee, flour, and other necessities while enduring the weight of their collective judgment, their disapproving glances following his every movement. Sheriff Thompson approached Jacob outside the store, his expression grave. "I am sorry about this mess, Sterling. That delegation had no business riding out to your place with threats, but feelings are running high in town. Some of the men have been drinking and talking foolishness about taking the law into their own hands." "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I am saying that marriage might be your only protection against mob justice. These are dangerous times for anyone who does not fit the mold that folks expect. Keep your head down and do what you must to keep that woman and child safe." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Ayanna had made her own difficult decision. As darkness fell, she wrapped Dakota in warm blankets and gathered her few possessions, preparing to slip away into the night. She would not force Jacob into an unwanted marriage that could destroy his standing in the community. Jacob returned to find her standing in the moonlight beside his corral, her traveling bundle at her feet. Without words, he understood her intention and felt his heart constrict with an emotion he had not experienced since losing his wife years earlier. "Please," he said simply, the single word carrying more weight than any lengthy speech. "Stay until morning. We will face this together." She looked into his weathered face and saw something that made her nod slowly. They spent a sleepless night sitting on the porch steps, each lost in contemplation of an uncertain future that would bind their fates together forever. Dawn broke gray and cheerless over the Texas plains as the sound of approaching wagons announced the return of the town delegation. This time they came prepared for ceremony, bringing with them a borrowed wedding dress of faded blue calico and official papers that would make the union legally binding in the eyes of territorial law. The preacher, his wife, had accompanied the group, her thin lips pressed into a disapproving line as she surveyed the modest ranch house. She carried the dress draped over her arm like a banner of moral victory, clearly taking satisfaction in her role as enforcer of community standards. "The dress belonged to my departed sister," she announced to Ayanna with cold efficiency. "It will serve well enough for this purpose, though I expect it returned immediately after the ceremony." Ayanna accepted the garment with quiet dignity, though Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders as she retreated to the bedroom to change. The dress hung awkwardly on her slender frame, designed for a woman of different build and heritage, but she emerged with her head held high and her dark hair arranged in a simple braid. Jacob had put on his only good shirt and black vest, the same outfit he had worn to his first wife, his funeral 3 years earlier. The irony was not lost on him as he stood in his own living room, surrounded by people who viewed this moment as a necessary correction rather than a celebration. The preacher opened his worn Bible and began reading the marriage ceremony in a voice devoid of warmth or joy. His words echoed hollowly in the small room as Jacob and Ayanna stood side by side, neither touching nor looking at each other during the brief proceedings. "Do you, Jacob Sterling, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death do you part?" "I do," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "And do you?" The preacher paused, realizing he did not know the woman, whose name. "Do you take Jacob Sterling to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Ayanna whispered, the English words careful and precise on her tongue. The merchant produced 2 simple gold bands purchased from his own store, and the rings were exchanged with mechanical precision. The preacher pronounced them man and wife without enthusiasm, closing his Bible with a sharp snap that seemed to seal their fate. After the delegation departed with their borrowed dress and satisfied consciences, Jacob and Ayanna stood alone in the sudden silence of their home, legally bound but emotionally distant, wondering what their future would hold. 3 nights after their reluctant wedding, Dakota's desperate cries shattered the prairie silence. Ayanna rushed to the baby, this makeshift cradle, her hands trembling as she felt the burning heat radiating from his tiny body. The infant, his skin was flushed scarlet with dangerous fever, his breathing rapid and shallow. Jacob appeared instantly at her side, taking one look at the child before grabbing his hat and coat. "I will ride to town for medicine," he declared, already moving toward the door. "Keep him cool with wet cloths until I return." The midnight ride to Willow Creek became a race against time as Jacob pushed his horse through the darkness, guided only by starlight and desperate determination. The general store would be closed, but Doc Harrison lived above his practice and could be roused for medical emergencies. However, fate intervened in the form of 3 drunk cowboys stumbling out of the saloon as Jacob thundered into town. They recognized him immediately as the man who had married the Indian woman, and their liquor-fueled courage transformed into ugly confrontation. "Look here, boys!" shouted the largest of the 3. "It is the man who married that Indian woman, come crawling to town in the middle of the night." "What is wrong, Sterling?" sneered another. "Your Indian wife not taking proper care of that baby." Jacob tried to push past them toward the doctor's office, but they blocked his path with malicious intent. "Please move aside," he said through gritted teeth. "The child is gravely ill and needs medicine. Maybe it would be better for everyone if that baby just went ahead and died," the third man suggested with cruel laughter. "One less burden for decent folks to worry about." The comment ignited something primal in Jacob's chest. Before he could think clearly, his fist connected with the speaker's jaw, sending the man sprawling into the dusty street. The other 2 immediately rushed him, and within moments all 4 men were engaged in a violent brawl. Sheriff Thompson emerged from his office at the sound of the commotion, firing his pistol into the air to break up the fight. "That is enough," he bellowed. "Sterling, get what you need and get out of town before this gets worse. You 3, sleep it off in my jail." Jacob stumbled to Doc Harrison's office with blood on his knuckles and fire in his eyes, collecting the precious medicine that would save Dakota's life. The confrontation had marked him as a man willing to fight for his family, regardless of the consequences to his own safety. Jacob returned to the ranch near dawn with bruised knuckles and precious medicine bottles clinking in his saddlebags. He found Ayanna maintaining a vigil beside Dakota's cradle, her face etched with exhaustion and worry as she continued applying cool cloths to the baby's fevered skin. Without speaking, Jacob mixed the powdered medicine with water as Doc Harrison had instructed, creating a bitter liquid that would hopefully break the dangerous fever. Together, they coaxed small sips into Dakota's mouth, their hands occasionally touching as they worked in synchronized desperation to save the child. The next 48 hours blurred together in a continuous cycle of medicine administration, temperature monitoring, and shared anxiety. Jacob abandoned his usual ranch duties to help care for the sick infant, bringing fresh water from the well and preparing simple meals that neither adult had much appetite to eat. During the worst moments, when Dakota's breathing became labored and his tiny body burned with heat, Jacob and Ayanna found themselves naturally gravitating toward each other for support. She would lean against his shoulder during the long night watches, and he would place a gentle hand on her back when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. On the 3rd morning, the fever finally broke. Dakota opened his dark eyes with clarity for the first time in days, focusing on the faces hovering anxiously above him. A weak smile crossed his tiny features, and both adults felt simultaneous relief wash over them like cool rain after a drought. The shared crisis had forged something genuine between them that their forced marriage ceremony could never have created. Jacob watched Ayanna sing soft lullabies to the recovering baby and realized that his protective instincts had evolved into something deeper and more complex than mere duty. Ayanna, in turn, had witnessed Jacob's willingness to risk his own safety for Dakota's welfare. The bruises on his knuckles told a story of confrontation in town, and she understood that he had fought for their family against those who would see them destroyed. As Dakota's strength gradually returned, Jacob and Ayanna began sharing longer glances across the room. Their movements around each other became more fluid and natural, less careful and distant. Small gestures of affection began appearing in their daily routine, a hand briefly touching a shoulder, concerned inquiries about fatigue, shared smiles over the baby's returning appetite. The experience had revealed their capacity for partnership beyond the legal bonds imposed by outside pressure, suggesting possibilities neither had dared imagine during their first uncertain days together. In the weeks following Dakota's recovery, Jacob made determined efforts to learn Ayanna's true name as she had pronounced it in her native tongue. Each evening after supper, he would sit beside her near the fireplace, carefully repeating the syllables until his rough voice could approximate the musical sounds of her language. Ayanna, he would practice, rolling the unfamiliar vowels around his mouth like smooth stones. She would correct him patiently, sometimes placing her hand gently over his to demonstrate the rhythm of her people's speech patterns. These lessons became treasured moments of cultural exchange that bridged the vast differences in their backgrounds. Ayanna began revealing more of herself during these intimate evening sessions. She showed Jacob the intricate patterns used in traditional basket weaving, teaching him to recognize the symbolic meanings woven into geometric designs. Her skilled fingers could transform simple prairie grass into beautiful containers that seemed too fine for ordinary ranch use. The house itself underwent a gradual transformation as Ayanna added personal touches that made the space feel less like a bachelor's solitary refuge and more like a genuine home. She arranged wildflowers in mason jars, hung colorful blankets on the walls, and placed small carved figures on the mantelpiece that represented protective spirits from her ancestral beliefs. Jacob found himself remembering his late mother, his final words about opening his heart to love again after grief. The old woman had made him promise not to spend his remaining years in lonely isolation, though he had dismissed her advice at the time as the rambling of a dying mind. Now he wondered if she had possessed some prophetic wisdom about the healing power of unexpected companionship. Their evening conversations, though still limited by language barriers, began carrying new warmth and genuine interest. Jacob would describe his daily encounters with wildlife during cattle rounds, and Ayanna would share stories about her childhood in the distant mountains, using gestures and simple English words to paint pictures of a vanished way of life. Dakota thrived in this atmosphere of growing affection, becoming a bridge between two adults who might otherwise have remained forever distant. The baby responded equally to both caregivers, reaching for Jacob's weathered hands with the same trust he showed toward his mother. These moments of shared parenthood created bonds that neither adult had anticipated when their arrangement began. Small acts of consideration flowed naturally between them now. Jacob would leave early morning coffee prepared exactly as Ayanna preferred, and she would mend his clothing with decorative stitching that transformed practical repairs into works of art. The transformation from duty to devotion occurred on a quiet autumn evening as golden light filtered through the kitchen window. Jacob sat at the table repairing a bridle while Ayanna prepared supper, their domestic routine now flowing with natural harmony that neither questioned nor analyzed. Dakota played contentedly on a blanket near the fireplace, his laughter filling the house with innocent joy that had become the soundtrack of their unlikely family. The baby had grown stronger and more alert, his dark eyes bright with curiosity as he explored his small world under the watchful care of two adults who loved him deeply. Without warning or conscious decision, Ayanna crossed the room and placed her hand gently over Jacob's weathered fingers. The simple gesture carried profound meaning, representing her deliberate choice to bridge the final distance between them. Her touch was soft but intentional, a silent declaration that their marriage need not remain merely a legal arrangement. Jacob looked up from his work to meet her eyes, seeing reflected there the same mixture of hope and vulnerability that had been growing in his own heart. The barriers of culture, language, and circumstance that had once seemed insurmountable now appeared as fragile as morning mist before the rising sun. "We are truly married now," he said quietly, understanding that their union had finally become real through choice rather than coercion. She nodded, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that sealed their commitment more powerfully than any formal ceremony could have accomplished. In the months that followed, their love continued deepening through shared experiences and mutual respect. Jacob realized that while he had originally married Ayanna to protect her from community judgment, she and Dakota had actually rescued him from a life of bitter solitude and endless regret over losses he could not control. Their home became a sanctuary where two wounded souls found healing through the simple act of caring for each other. Jacob taught Ayanna to read English words, while she shared the ancient wisdom of her people about living in harmony with the harsh but beautiful land that surrounded them. The townspeople of Willow Creek gradually accepted their unusual family, though some continued harboring private reservations about the arrangement. Jacob no longer cared about their opinions, having discovered that true happiness came from following the dictates of conscience rather than the expectations of others. As winter approached, bringing long nights perfect for storytelling and quiet conversation, Jacob understood that genuine mercy had indeed created something beautiful from desperate circumstances. Their love had grown slowly from seeds of compassion, proving that the most enduring unions are often forged in the crucible of mutual sacrifice rather than passion alone.